Kimberly, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I am so excited to get a chance to talk to you. You have written
a new oil painting.
I love this book. This book is huge. It's very important. My people, please check this book out. This is super important for safety and general education for people that are using oil media. Frankly, this should become the textbook, in art schools everywhere. It should be required reading. You don't have this in audio, do you?
I actually just reached out to Chronicle Books,
because I need that.
Yeah,
I need an audio book.
Yeah, I need to record an audiobook.
That will help me just go over and over the concepts, because there's so much there that I want to remember. And you talk about all kinds of mediums. You talk about solvents and safety while you're in your studio. This covers so many topics, and it's a deep dive. I'm still going through it with my highlighter pen because, a few years ago, probably 5 years ago, I suddenly developed allergies to like every chemical on earth seemingly out of the blue. And I think it was the perfect storm because there's so many chemicals in our environment without turning purposely to something like oil paints and adding that and the solvents. That I was working at the time, I had a job managing a print shop. So I was doing some graphic design and working in the print shop at the time, but I'm very allergic to formaldehyde, and that's always been the case apparently. And the adhesives in the formaldehyde, the laminating products, and the paper. I had no idea how much formaldehyde is involved in the production of paper, and there was paper dust everywhere.
Wow, that's fascinating. I
Yep.
regret that I didn't mention that, come to think of it. I mean, I have a whole section on paper for painting, but it's very focused on painting. But whenever you have off-gassing as a byproduct of the production process, so when we get paper at the art store, it hopefully has finished off-gassing. But I've once bought oil prime linen from a huge New York company, pre-prime linen, because it was in the days when I was in the mood for the silkiest, most fabulous, and I got the same manufacturer that Hockney uses, David Hockney.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to contact these people directly and buy a big roll. And I don't know what was in that roll, but my lungs would seize whenever I unrolled it. And it got to the point I kept putting it further and further back in my studio.
Yep.
And same thing happened to me. I got just 15 years into painting. I was working on, I was stapling canvas to a wall because I was in the mood. I'm very experimental, but I was in the mood for not allowing the feeling of preciousness of the object of a painting own me. Like I didn't want it.
Totally get you.
So I wanted to feel like, this is going to be the Basquiat me, the one that just flings paint around and scriggles on, because I don't care, because I'm not feeling like I'm painting on a precious armoire of furniture was $300 and the highest, and all that. So I was admittedly in a corner of the studio because the drawback to stapling, and I got one of those power staple guns. I figured I'll stretch it afterwards if it's the Mona Lisa. But the drawback of stapling it to the wall is that you can't take it off the wall and turn it around until it's dry.
Right.
And that's a key part. It made me realize the whole experience that's a critical part of the oil painting process, is being able to have a fresh look and to turn it around and turn it away from you. But, those were early days. So I was in a corner, I was not in the most ventilated place. And as usual, without thinking about it. And by the way, this is what I was taught in schools in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Paris. Like I had always been taught the same. You have a little can, a little tin, whatever you want to put it in, of solvent. That's kind of to rinse your brushes off. And And then, of course, your glazing medium was a third Damar, a third solvent, and a third linseed oil, which is what they teach. It's in the Ralph Meyer handbook. It's in all these books, this daisy chain of books dating back to the mid 19th century. And so it was de rigueur, like just like that's how you changed your brushes. And suddenly my lungs started to feel really like something was heavy on them. And I went outside. It was a beautiful sunny day in Venice where my studio is, and had a little patch of grass in front of this little garage that I had been renting. And I just put my hands on my knees and I leaned forward and I couldn't pull in a breath. And it was the scariest thing. And, I'm kind of, and I thought to myself, I'm poisoning myself. It was just, and I'm a mom with 2 kids. And if you go through pregnancy, for example, and because I'm very cerebral, so it's easy for me to get disconnected from my body, which is like, just sort of not pay attention to things. But when you go through motherhood, especially, or you just start to become really sensitive to what you're putting in your children's bodies and your bodies, like that's going to wake you up to it, And I said, I need to change. I need to stop using this stuff. Like I have to stop. And that was my ferocious moment of saying, okay, what's the lay of the land? What do I use? Do I go to acrylic? Do I go to water miscible oils? Do I go to, what is this concoction anyway? Like, yeah, I had a similar moment.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, but I had I had always had eczema. That was something that I discovered in junior high, and I managed it by avoiding a lot of unnecessary water. My hands would react to water. They would dry out very quickly, things like that. But when this started, I was older, and it was a different kind of reaction. I was told it was a secondary form of eczema, but it was the perfect storm of the formaldehyde in the paper, the adhesives, probably some of the inks, just all the chemicals. And I was also oil painting. And I had a similar, come to Jesus moment where I was in my studio before I got my air purifier, which I'm going to ask you about. But I remember a couple of different sessions, even a couple of years ago, where I'm standing at my easel and I started to feel like I was going to black out. I started feeling like I was going to faint. And I ended up, like, my husband came in and I was actually sitting on the floor and he's like, what's the matter? And I just started to see those black spots. And I didn't know why. I was covering my solvent. I was in a small room. The window was open. I had a fan. I was lost.
It's the thing. It's this myth that you can protect yourself from air, from
Right.
what the air you're breathing. The shocking thing is they don't even sell the proper masks to protect you from solvent at the art store.
Yeah.
And, my relationship with solvents was very much my relationship with the medium in the first place, because I started off as acrylic because I felt like, well, solvents is the grown-up material, like, and a lot of people who have that urge, everybody knows who they are, it doesn't matter whether or not right now they're in real estate or whatever, but if you have that urge to paint, you're going to go to the art store and you're going to look at the apothecary madness that's on the store shelves for oil. And you're going to go, I can't deal with this. I'm going to start with acrylic just to get my feet wet. That has formaldehyde in it, by the way. I don't know, that in the process, and also it off gases. And, as somebody that cares about the environment, when you think about the microplastics that you're casually rinsing down the drain because you think, well, thank God this doesn't need solvent, so no problem for washing my brushes. And then you eventually, hopefully, graduate to oil, but then you're in solvent land. And then people would walk into my studio just, when I'd have a studio visit, and they would be like, oh, I love the smell. It smells like creativity. Like they literally associate solvent with creativity. But, the big the best things that you can do to wean yourself off solvent is, and well, we're going to get to the big thing, is to discover the oil and chalk medium, because I don't use solvent at all anymore. So but it's also how you wash your brushes and to have more brushes, because a lot of times you'll use a fewer amount of brushes and you have to resist that urge to dip it into the terp or the solvent or the OMS or whatever you want to use to wipe off the color to go into a new color. So if you get a wide mouth mason jar, they have two kinds. They have like, I think it's 3-inch and 5-inch, whatever. You get the wider one. They have them at Smart and Final, Bed Bath and Beyond, Target, Home Depot. And then if you have more brushes, they can fan out without touching each other. So some people paint and they put their brushes on the, I once had a student who was an art teacher, by the way, who kept a coffee tin of solvent about 1/4 inch in it and kept his brushes upside down in it, which of course ruins the ferrule, just to constantly be able to not have to worry about, changing the color. So changing the color is a huge part of a reason why we're addicted to solvent. And then also the myth that you need solvent to clean your brushes. So I've been painting for 30 years. And let's say for a good 10, I was in classes, like I would always need to, if I was feeling out of touch with because before I became a full-on exhibiting artist and got a gallery and museums and whatnot, I was in that mode that many people are in, where you're sort of kind of figuring it out and not hiding in your art, but you're sort of understanding it's like a lot of people, it's just sort of understanding how it all works and works together, because it is a craft, even though a lot of art schools and a lot of people don't want to interrupt your creativity with the concept or the word of craft, which is the whole de-skilling, which is a movement, a de-skilling concept. And
don't even get me started on the whole business.
Yeah.
You've probably heard me rant on the show about the the need for business training, financial information training.
The myth that you need to be stupid and in order to be more creative is so far from the truth. And so all through these classes, the lectures and education about how to clean your brushes and how to set your table and how to come up with a system that doesn't force you to kind of get reoriented every time you start, has made it so that a lot of people have developed habits that just expose them to more and more solvent, bad habits. So especially after getting sick, I spent a lot of time thinking about what's going to be the most efficient and clean and environmentally friendly way, zero waste way, and zero off-gassing way for me to approach this medium. And my father was a surgeon, and before, this was a long time ago, and he used to bring me to watch him operate in the room. I would scrub up with him when I was like a kid, because I wanted to be a surgeon at one point. And the way that they have the instrument tray and everything laid out before them. And, I would watch him just put out his hand and say scalpel, whatever it was, knife, whatever, 00 silk, when he was sewing people up. And I thought, I need to recreate this frictionless environment in my studio so that I'm conscious of when and where I'm at, how to avoid waste and exposing myself to harmful solvents. We really dove right into it, didn't we?
We did. I knew we were going to. I thought, let me introduce you because we're going to get right to it. I think there's a mindfulness component that you're talking about, and being present as you're painting instead of just going on autopilot, because autopilot can be dangerous.
Well, yes, if you're not approaching it from the start with understanding all the pitfalls. And one of the things that I did not include in my book because it's something that I discovered after it was submitted. Writing a book, with a traditional publisher is like a very surreal process because I submitted it in the fall of 2018 and it didn't come out until 2022. And then there was that thing where that tanker got stuck in the Suez Canal. And so it was delayed. I was like, it's on there. It's on there. That's why they keep delaying the publication. So it didn't come out till June of 2021. And, because it involved pictures and it was technical and it was being vetted by chemists from, organic chemists from Stanford and whatnot. Like it was a kind of a rigorous, it wasn't like a novel, it was much bigger than, so what am I saying? So that process may be unable to include something that I also discovered that I really like is I used to always have a stack of paper towels on the left of my palette area so that I would wipe my brushes off there, even though I don't use solvent. And even though I have that gigantic mason jar with the brushes fanned outward so they don't touch each other. But anyway, so I replaced it for watercolor paper, pads of watercolor paper. And because I think of color, every kind of paint, every kind of color, it's like a kind of gold, you don't want to waste it. And so I also have a technique for storing unused color. And when you don't use solvent and all that smelly stuff, you can take so much more advantage of the medium because you can literally scoop up with a palette knife at the end of a painting day, the color that you've mixed, cross it on the lip of a sealable container, and then it reduces the surface area of what's the paint that it's exposed. And it becomes almost like a little gob of toothpaste, but it develops a film over it. And then months later, you can take a pin in it and squeeze out that exact color. So that's in the book. That's in the book. But the thing that wasn't in the book is that I still had to wipe off my brushes. So I would use paper towel. But now I use watercolor paper and I end up having multiple pieces where every time a layer dries, I put another one down and they look like these incredible abstract paintings now. And then I cut them up and those are my note cards. In fact, I gave you one.
Yes, I use I've made bookmarks from mine where when I watercolor, like you said, when you have those extra swipes. So that's a terrific idea.
Yeah. So try it with oil. It's sexy. It's so sexy because it's like frozen rock, it's so beautiful. It's just, it's amazing. I love painting.
Well, thank you. So, after a couple of episodes of feeling like I was going to faint in my studio, I ended up investing in what I thought was a really good air purifier. And I do use it. It's always on. And it is a charcoal filter that's supposed to clean the volatile organic compounds, or VOCs for our listeners, that emit gases from certain solids and liquids. It filters those out of the air. And I've been using Gamsol in a tiny amount, probably a quarter inch at a time, in a mason jar, small one, because they have that 2-part lid where you can have the disc on top with a little lip, so you can drop it on there to keep it covered while you are not using it. And I rarely need it because I do dry wipe my brushes and just, instead of swishing them, I just dry wipe them. And if I'm switching colors, but it sounds like that air purifier is not enough. Mm-mm. So even if it's not signaling that it's in the orange or in the red,
it's not worth it.
Yeah.
Somebody who also has eczema, by the way, so like I can relate to that, and allergies and migraines and, whatever, which I stopped getting, by the way, it's not worth it. And one of the issues is that oil is I was at the Getty yesterday and I was looking at all the paintings from the 1500s that are oil on panel and mixed with tempera because they were originally using it to see if they could protect make the tempera paintings impervious. And then they were like, wow, this stuff is great. It's really flexible too. Gee, I could paint this on cloth. And if I could paint it on cloth, that means when I get a commission from that Italian guy down in Rome in my studio in Florence, I could like make it 8 by 10 feet and just have it rolled up and delivered when it dries. And that's when you started. So painting is a kind of a technology. And the advantages of that technology have been so misunderstood. And the last few centuries, because there wasn't a textbook for it. It was the formulas weren't written down. This misconception got perpetuated, which was that you need resin. And so let's back up and talk about solvents for a second.
I'm allergic to resin too.
Okay. So the only reason why you need to use solvent is to dilute resin. Solvents dry by evaporation. Oil dries by oxidation. They're two different chemical reactions with the air in order to create what they are. Solvents they weaken the bonds that oil forms to bind the little tiny rocks into place. And oil hardens and becomes heavier over time. And it's an exothermic reaction, oxidation. So a molecule is being grabbed from the air of oxygen, and it's releasing heat in order to do that process. And that's why if you have a lot of oil-soaked rags, they can potentially, it's never happened to me, but they can spontaneously combust. But when you throw solvents which evaporate into the mix, and acrylic also dries by evaporating too, but when you throw solvents into the mix, it becomes toxic. And there was this myth that you needed resin, which requires solvents to dissolve. So Damar, when you go to the art store and you see Damar varnish, which makes your paintings beautiful and shiny. But I have a whole chapter on varnishing. You don't need to use that anymore. When you see Damar varnish, those used to come in rocks. They were like crystals. And the only way to get them to be in a form that a painter could use is you needed solvent to dissolve them. But solvent isn't needed for oil. It just weakens the paint film. And so the only reason why solvents were introduced, because there was this, in Leonardo's treatise on painting, there's like a mention of toning a canvas with sandarac and oil of spike. Like there's allusions to solvent, because you have to picture these guys. They were like in a church somewhere with, or they were in some like beautiful, or who knows what kind of building. And they had like cadavers in one table where they were like trying to figure out how the body worked. And then they had like, they were alchemists in another corner where they were trying to find, a slurry that would make them live forever. And then they had the painters painting with things like, people didn't really know how things work. So they had to kind of figure it out by a lab situation, but we have modern science now. So we now know how things work. And so the fact that you are using solvent with oil without resin makes no sense from a chemistry standpoint. But my big highlight of this train of thought is that because of the prevalence of solvent that's being handed down from teacher to teacher to teacher, is that people are approaching oil painting as if it's a medium that it's not meant to be. And they're being taught alla prima, which is to try to do things all in one sitting or do things faster, and the need for speed and all that. And there's ways to accomplish that without solvent. And so when I go to my studio, it smells like my coffee. It doesn't smell like anything. It smells like oil drying a little bit, but there's zero need for me I could like work in a hermetically sealed room. I don't need a purifier. It took me 6 months to undo the habits of dipping the brush into solvent, of how I rinse my brushes. It took me 6 months. And it was like I was addicted to a drug, honestly. Like I had like my nasty, smelly stuff in the corner. And I'd be like, okay, I'm not going to use this today. I'm going to like test myself, but anyway, I didn't mean to get so technical, but you don't need solvent. You don't need solvent at all. And you don't need the purifier. I know that's shocking, but you don't need the purifier.
That's good.
Yeah.
So what do you use instead, of course, is the magic question. I have tried at first, when I was having difficulty with my allergies, I switched to walnut oil. And then I discovered that, of course, walnut oil for cooking was not the same thing as artist grade. It made everything beat up.
Yeah.
But even then I found that the walnut oil, it had a different feel. I want to say there was more drag. So you have also said specifically about walnut oil, which was a favorite of Da Vinci and Perugino and Raphael, that it's less durable than other oils as a medium. So what does that mean? And what should we be using?
So there's walnut oil and safflower oil are clearer than linseed oil. So it becomes about color, speed, and viscosity. By the way, that could be like the new diamond.
I was just thinking that it's like the three C's, right? But the one's a B.
Yeah. So they found that when they took linseed oil and they put it in the sun, that's how they started. And there's recipes for this in Vasari's La Vite, the lives of artists, and where you take linseed oil, you put it in the sun, and they have these elaborate things to try to catch the bugs, from getting into it. It pre-polymerizes it. What little chains forms oil painting, the way when it polymerizes, it forms these beautiful little, in my mind, they're these beautiful little chains of carbon atom chains, and the sun kind of speeds up that process and it makes it clearer, but it also makes it thicker. So stand oil, which some of you may be familiar with, is a clearer, thicker formula. And they call it stand oil is because they arrive at a different place. They actually they go through this process of heating it slowly, and then the impurities would fall to the bottom and they'd have to let it stand in order to get rid of the impurities, So that's why they don't do this anymore, but they still call it stand oil. I mean, the names are really funny. It's like lamp black. The paint color was one of the early organic compounds that they used to scrape the inside of a lamp to get the black. Just the color section of the book is one of my favorite sections. I could literally talk about it forever. Like I could talk about the color blue for like an hour, but whenever I talk about the book, I'm always talking about solvents. So there's a huge, wonderful part of the book that talks about color. So when walnut oil and safflower oil are less durable, it's clearer, but they don't form as strong of bonds. So linseed oil is really the best oil, but you can't get any oils that are made from the food industry because they put preservatives in it to increase the shelf life because they're making it at an industrial scale. So you need to have, you need to kind of understand the medium, literally like what you're using. So inside a tube of paint, every pigment has a desire for a certain ratio of oil to it. And there's an acronym, I should say, called pigment to volume concentration, PVC. And if you just paint with oil, you're going to be creating an imbalance in how much oil is to the pigment. But chalk, which they have many names for, you can get it at the hardware store, you can get it calcium carbonate, marble dust, and each different kind of marble, like Carrara marble, all the different marbles have a different kind of quality to them, but they're very minor. But you could literally just go on Kremer paints, or, you could get it on Amazon, a bag of calcium carbonate, and it should be fine. It shouldn't have any texture to it. And it does this amazing thing. It dissolves in the oil and becomes clear. So it's an invisible pigment. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, it can't be true. I need to test this, which is exactly what I did. I was like, this can't be true. So I took, let's say, 2 parts chalk into 1 part oil, And I remember taking cadmium red. I'm like, this is going to lighten it because this is this white powder and I'm putting it in, and it's not toxic to inhale, but obviously you don't want to like breathe in a bunch of dust, but it's not like fine glass, which will cause black lung. It's just dust. It's rock dust. But when you put it in, it does something incredible, is that it lowers the opacity of the paint. So it increases the transparency. So you can do a glaze of cadmium red over something. You know how zinc is this sort of problematic paint, but when it was discovered, they thought, oh, look, this is a paint that we can use in lieu of lead, to make those fine little lacings, but it's super brittle. And a lot of times manufacturers will combine it with titanium white. And again, this is like, we could do a whole other podcast on colors and pigments and paints.
Now I was going to ask that about the titanium. I have a half and half mix, zinc and titanium. And I'm like, should I use this or is this not a good idea?
It's fine. I mean, I'm sure you probably have one that's mixed with some additive like barium sulfite or, which makes it really buttery. But the snobby paint world art nerds really want it to be ropey instead of buttery, which is when a paint gets thixotropic, which is what lead white, like I said, rabbit hole. Let's go back to the chalk. So
we were talking chalk.
Yes.
So you mix the chalk with what?
Oil, with linseed oil.
Linseed oil.
Yeah. And so now I don't do this in some kind of porcelain or metal or special cup, like a small cup. I go to the restaurant supply store and I get those little ketchup cups and I scoop up a couple tablespoons of chalk and then I squirt, because I keep my oil in a squirt bottle. I squirt the type of oil I want. And I go into such great detail about this in the book, but like I'm funny, so it's like interesting. But anyway, so I put it in and then I take a chopstick and I swirl it around. And this is all disposable because you don't want to wash oil down the drain. You don't want to wash any of the stuff down the drain. It'll clog your pipes, but you can dispose of it. It's literally oil and little tiny invisible rocks, right? So it's not going to harm the environment, nothing like that. And you tip that mixture into your mix color, and then you take a palette knife and then you mix it into it, and you will get a glaze that's even sexier and more malleable than that concoction that's promoted in all the other books, which is a third Damar. Yeah. You will be able to make like a transparent veil. Like think of that paint, that portrait of Queen Elizabeth, where the collar is like that insane see-through collar. You can do that with titanium white, because if you just put enough chalk in it, it becomes invisible and dissolves. It doesn't just become invisible. It dissolves in the oil and becomes clear.
Wow. Velasquez would just roll over in his grave and be like, woohoo.
No. So Velasquez is the one, in fact, he was one of the people that wrote down and recorded that this is what he did. And so there's a couple paint manufacturers who make a pre-made version of this putty. I personally like to make it. But in any case, because Velasquez is one of the people that recorded this method of using chalk, they have a tube called Velasquez Medium, which is simply stand oil and chalk. So, and there's a whole chapter about this and how to make the mediums and everything like that. But the other thing you're dealing with is viscosity. So definitely one of the things you're going to have to get used to is the wateriness that you're making your paints with the solvent. You're going to have to leave that experience behind in order to wean yourself solvents. And that's what took me 6 months. It was the best effort I've ever put into my life because it gave me back painting. After I got really sick, I thought somebody like ripped my voice out of my body. Like, how am I going to it wasn't an express yourself thing. I mean, as people who paint know, it's almost like a chronic condition. Like it's not something you can help. It doesn't really make that much sense that you're going to spend hours and hours of day moving tiny colored rocks into some configuration that you think could inspire other people because you know it inspires you. But if you paint, you can't help it.
Yeah.
So you can't help it. It's like and why not? And I feel like people are born with paintings inside them and they need to get them out. So why not extend your lifespan? Bob Ross died young of lymphoma, which is one of the cancers that's caused by solvent exposure.
Wow.
So many painters have died too young in the last couple centuries because of solvent exposure and just being in rooms with no ventilation. And there's even like a macho-ness in the attitude of art students, where they'll like smear lead paint on there, whatever, I remember having a teacher who was painting without gloves and was using lead paint and smearing it with his finger. And I'm like, dude, do you have a death wish? In my mind.
No, I remember I was in college and there were two things I noticed. One of them was that the teachers were very, very snobbish about painting specifically with pure gum spirits of turpentine. And of course, here's turpentine.
Literally the worst of the solvents.
Oh yeah. Talk about VOCs. And so I noticed that. And of course, at first that was what I painted with because that's what I knew. And then the people that were getting paint on their skin and not registering it. And I first did when I was in a class with a painter in New York. I had paint on my hands. And here I am, the last person in the world who should have paint on their hands because I always had cuts from the eczema. And she said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Go wash yourself right now." And she really made a big deal out of it. And it was a good thing because the other teachers weren't. And it really jogged me about not touching my paints. And now I see a lot of videos, you'll see people, and one really made me mad. I just released an online course about painting, and I had seen other painters instructing on video and smudging their paints with their fingers. And I'm screaming at the video going, "What are you doing? We don't touch our paints."
I know.
You don't
eat it and don't touch it. Anything is toxic if you eat it. If I were to drink a bottle of dishwashing liquid, I would get very sick. The toxicity rating in painting is based on ingesting a spoonful. This is an interesting little thing that I learned. So when they say like a paint is toxic, are you literally going to squirt? Yes, if you have babies and toddlers who, are getting into things, you need to keep it away from them. But if you paint every day with oil paints, even lead paint, and you don't eat it and smear it on your body, you're totally good. You're never going to get sick from it. So that's kind of, let me talk a little bit about OMS versus turpentine. So maybe 5 or so years into my oil painting, madness, like my chronic condition, like when I was just going, I can't deal with acrylic, it dries too fast. I was also taught to use turpentine. And then OMS was created by the National Portrait Gallery as a formula, and Gamblin, it's public because it was funded by the government, said, this would be great for painters. And the National Portrait Gallery made it to help clean paintings with less odor. And it's for dissolving alkyds, not resins. So just put your head around that. So you have solvents are for diluting Damar crystals. So turpentine, but odorless mineral spirits is for dissolving alkyds. So it has a much lower evaporation rate and is more expensive, and it's still terrible for you to breathe. So when I got really sick, I had been only using OMS for years thinking it was safer, but it's not. It's not. And you asked me this, you said, what do you mean when if you're using more than a couple drops? So when I'm toning a canvas, and I just had this museum exhibition called, my latest work features large architectural and landscape, paintings, and I was toning a 6 by 9 foot canvas, and I didn't do it with a drop of solvent, not even a drop, but and I basically take like large grapefruit patches of color, and this is all in the book, how to do this. And then I create my putty, and then I mix those huge patches with the putty so that it's more translucent. And I take a chip brush and I push the brush. One of the things that you have to get used to when you're painting without solvent in the toning layer, because that's the layer that people want it the most because they want to make it runny, is you don't drag the brush like you're petting a cat the right way. You push into it like you're petting a cat the wrong way. So you get the cheap chip brushes, which they also don't sell at the art store. The ones they sell at the art store is like $2.39. Like they're expensive, and sometimes they have acrylic things, and they're things that you have to wash. You don't want those big chip brushes that you have to wash, because then you're putting that stuff down the drain, the chemicals, the pigments in the water supply. So you want disposable chip brushes, and the best place to get them is at a paint store. And you want a little pack of tweezers next to your little instrument tray with your brushes, so that when those cheap chip brushes that have like a lifespan of maybe 4 paintings start to lose hair, and they do immediately, like they suck in a way, like
that was my question, is what about all the hair that falls off?
Just get a pair of tweezers, like it's, and then when it's too stiff because the oil on it has polymerized to agree that it's not useful anymore, then throw it away. Don't wash those down the drain. And I digressed when I was talking about making the medium, and I said that I was using those disposable ketchup plastic things that you get at the restaurant supply store. It's because you don't want to have to wash out that cup. You don't want to have to wash out and put that down the drain.
So what you're saying is if you're using oils to dilute with the chalk instead of solvents, then it's safe to put it in a plastic container.
Yeah, and get just the thinnest possible, lightest weight container at Smart and Final. You can get them in bags of, you get a bag of 100 for $4. They're
Come with the squeeze bottles.
No, I'm talking about those little cups that when you want to get ketchup with your hot dog, and they put, or your vegan hot dog, and then you put it underneath the little pump and you press it. That's what I'm talking about.
Oh, but you also keep your oils in general. You store them in plastic squeeze bottles?
I do. I mean, the truth is that you want to minimize how much oxygen is touching the surface area of the oil in your jars, because the wider the jar. So in other words, oil is having an interaction with the oxygen where it polymerizes. So it's releasing heat, right? As it dries. So you want to minimize the surface area of what is exposed to the oxygen. So, I mean, that's just, like I said, nerd city. But yeah, so I use a squirt bottle because of the way I mix my putty medium, and I mix it every day. Actually, I miss like every other day. It depends on what I'm painting, but like the way I get into the mood is I just scoop, I mix my colors first, and then I mix my putty. So when you think about it, solvent is to thin the color too, right? So when you add chalk and oil with chalk in that putty, and if the chalk becomes invisible, then when you drag the brush, which makes it beautifully slide across the canvas, you're not interrupting the ratio of pigment to oil that you would if you were to have used only oil, but you would have too much oil. But you're basically putting spacers in between the color so that it becomes clear. I mean, you got to try it. It's hard to believe that it doesn't lighten it, but it's true. It doesn't lighten it. They use chalk to make cement. Chalk is oleophilic. It loves oil. It's when you see those planes flying over an oil spill, spraying that white powder, it's spraying chalk because the chalk sucks up the oil and it becomes clear. It's this amazing thing. And it's so natural and simple. And it doesn't off gas.
I'll be using it. I'm going to check into all of this because I've just went through your book and thought, wow, I have so many things that I can change for the better.
Yeah. And it just takes time. It just takes practice. Yeah.
Well, and it's well worth it. So we're talking about mixing. I read that I was reading something years ago and I keep trying to find it. It was on a blog and I can't seem to locate it. Again, it seems to have been taken down, but the artist was talking about chemicals and paints and reactions. And he was talking about, I thought it was the interaction of zinc and or cadmiums to metal, as in mixing with a palette knife. I was pretty sure he was talking about not using a metal palette knife to mix, especially like, say, zinc yellow. And I wondered if you had ever heard anything like this, because I don't like to mix with a plastic palette knife.
Here's the great news is that if you use zinc is a problematic pigment, but it's not like, we're so casual. We say things like never put acrylic over oil. Like, for example, like we don't put a water-based thing over it. And you think that when you do it, like the art police are going to come in with handcuffs and arrest you, right? Like, so you hear these things and then it makes you neurotic, it makes you, don't touch the zinc of the thing. But the truth is that zinc is, like I said, problematic, but they dilute it. You almost never use it raw anymore, meaning just zinc white. And you don't need to, because if you use oil and chalk, you don't need to. And lead white is even the best white paint for oil painters. They just banned it in Europe now. And all my students from England and, from Europe are saying, I can't get lead white anymore because, but we can get it here in America. But you don't need to use zinc. Number one, you don't need to use zinc or zinc yellow. So in lieu of using zinc yellow, I would use, get the yellow that you want and add chalk to it, add white and add chalk to it. And then that will simulate that. But I've never heard of that because I don't promote using zinc. In fact, I went to an artist workshop where all the people that were teaching it was a bunch of scientists. They had t-shirts that said, friends don't let friends use zinc. I was like, I am in nerd heaven. Yeah.
So wait, so are you at all saying that using the chalk,
go crazy?
well, what about the lead white? Is it something that you can use because you're using oils mixed with chalk, or lead white is just lead white anyway?
Lead white is an amazing, it's an amazing paint. It's the most durable. It's the most durable. It's the most beautiful. It's almost impossible to make skin not pasty without it. Like if you look at an Ong painting or, Vermeer, that's lead white. You're not going to you can tell when something's painted with titanium white is very blue. It's some people, like, let's say you have kids who don't want to, you don't want them getting, let's say, God forbid, you don't want anybody eating your paint. But let's say you had somebody that might eat your paint, like a pet or whatever, like you were just worried about it. You could simulate the effects of lead paint by using stand oil, and because stand oil is ropey and chalk, and maybe I'm talking about like titanium or one of your mixing whites, and then you like a molecule of, raw sienna. But it's never going to get the beauty and the luminosity of lead paint. When you go to museums and you see that's all lead white. So lead is, it's just, but it's tricky. That's like a whole other, I never use it in the bottom. I only use it at the very end. It's kind of like vermilion or lapis lazuli. Those are the real metals. Vermilion is mercuric sulfide. You can't even get that anymore. But lapis lazuli, again, we should do another podcast where we just talk about color but ultramarine blue is a synthetic organic pigment. And I can always tell when I used to teach in person before the pandemic at Otis, the newer students, because they all use way too much of it. They just all I can tell a new painter when everything is hot blue, And I'd be like, can you glaze that with with burnt sienna to just chill that down? Because I feel like my pupils need a volume knob, like turn it down, But yeah, so I wouldn't worry about metal palette knives. I couldn't live without them.
Amen, sister. So let's talk about your paintings for a minute, because you're right. We could go all day on your book and then another all day on the pigments themselves. Your recent exhibition, Painting Architecture, is fascinating. How would you describe your creative voice, or specifically with respect to that show and or in general?
Well, I work in series, and it's almost, in my mind, it's almost like every time I do a body of work, it's like making an album. And sometimes like it's a ballad and sometimes it's a rock, like there's different types of each painting. I don't paint. Sometimes when you go into a gallery or a museum, like all the paintings kind of look alike. Mine have a little bit more elasticity within a body of work, but I used to paint people. And I feel like painting can often become a type of excavation inside oneself. And a lot of times in the beginning, we paint people, because it's a great way to cut your teeth. Like it's a great way to learn how to paint, because painting people is the hardest thing to paint. So for the first half of my career, I was painting people and exhibiting people. And I did a series called Mom's Friends about my mother and her friends in the 80s, growing up in Marin from my point of view as a child. And it was during a time when it was just right after, everybody who grew up in the 50s and then got married in the 60s and then the 70s, and and then the sexual revolution happened, and all the women started getting divorced and having careers. And Connie Chung was on the cover of Time magazine saying, I forgot to have a baby. And, just like that whole thing, like that's so my work often is a commentary about something that's going on in the zeitgeist, but it's purely by accident. Like it's not something I'm intentionally doing, but I kind of realize that it means something. And about 10 years ago, around the death of my father, I stopped painting people. And I've gone through many different things, and I painted just portraiture. I did a project called the Stylist Project, where I painted the most famous stylists in the world, styled themselves and posed for their portrait for me. So I painted Grace Coddington and that was all about fashion as a language within painting. And so my recent exhibition is at the end, it is sort of like I'm in this evolution where I stopped painting people and started painting interiors and landscapes, because I think that landscape, which I had never really explored before, and it's such a huge subject, is a way to capture a fantasy within. It's a way to kind of hallucinate in a way about an ideal vista and environment that can give you such peace, that can make you live in another kind of reality. And I like incorporating landscape with man-made structures. So that's why there's always some kind of an architectural element, even if you're seeing it through a window or it's mostly landscape, but you're just seeing something within it. So, and I'm still deep in this. Like I've been here for like 4 years, I would say, like my last 4 shows, Fever Dreams, it's all it's been with exploring the landscape. And, as painters, I think that every subject has so many different, it's like a gigantic tree with all these branches and ways and approaches and things. And so I tend to dive deep into a subject before, and I don't really choose what I want to paint. It's either done with me or it isn't, I teach painting online, and I started doing it before the pandemic. And I have an advanced class. I have a class that's all about painting, which is the nitty gritty with it's everything in the book and more, like about the creative process, everything. It's all about mediums, paints, pigments. It's everything that's in the book and times maybe 20, with videos and all that. But then I have an advanced class, which is really the class. It's almost like the class that I wish I had been exposed to when I was younger. And it's a year long. It's actually a year and a half long program. And it's a quarter where it's just portraiture, where you're really looking at portraiture through the lens of art history, contemporary art. It's not painting from a life. It's really looking at all the different kinds of portraiture throughout history, et cetera, and transposing the palettes of different artists and styles onto your own image. So what you make is yours. But the first quarter is portraiture. The next order is the landscape, and the next quarter is tableau, where you integrate people and landscape. And the next one is interiors, because interiors are oddly extraordinarily complex.
Yeah.
You sort of write, especially if you focus on portraiture, it's just sort of the cage that you're putting the human in. But if you really get into interiors, they're really hard to make look great.
I agree.
You have to understand layering and everything. But anyway, then the last 6 months is about abstraction. And I don't have a podcast, but I have a lecture series called First Person Artist. So I have 50 different, I used to do it live where I'd go to people's studios with all my gear, but I have each quarter has a visiting, like an hour-long deep dive lecture with various artists who are working in that space from a subject point of view, from every different angle. So I know I went off topic again. I was talking about my work, but I thought, but you know what? Your audience are painters. So I knew that they would appreciate, because we're all struggling with the same thing. We're all still learning.
We are. We are. And I'm reminding my listeners, the show is for all artists, because I call it the Passionate Painter, but I couldn't resist the alliteration. And in fact, I'm the passionate painter too, in that I get really passionate about all things art. So I tend to focus on painting, but it's for everybody. But yes, I think this is the perfect venue for you to share all of these things, because people do wonder your motivation and what really, not just your motivation, but where did you get it from? How did you keep your creativity going? People want to know where can I get my ideas to find my voice? And what I like to tell my students is start producing, start painting. And the more you paint, the more you draw, the more you make sculptures, the more you create. Your voice has always been there, but the more you will learn to actually recognize it and realize what's always been there.
Get them out of your body. They're there.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of the Forrest Gump scene where when Gary says he's being sarcastic, but he says, "Have you found God?" And Forrest says, "Well, I didn't know I was supposed to be looking for him."
That's beautiful.
I think that our creative voices are part of us, and it's like when fish say, "Well, what's water?" We're already looking through our creative lens. You just have to create enough that you suddenly realize and get in touch with what's always been there. So I think that our listeners are very interested in what makes you tick.
Well, if I could loop this back to how we started.
Yeah.
Which is, for those painters who are oil painters who have been dipping brushes into terp their whole life because that's what they were taught. If you actually use oil and you bow down to the medium itself, which is this sort of thing that dries slowly, because that's the problem, is we all have the need for speed. So we add terp because it'll make it evaporate and weaken the bonds and dry faster. But the chalk, by the way, makes it dry faster, incidentally. So you don't need turpentine. But if you allow it to dry slowly and you work in layers, as opposed to trying to do things in one sitting where you're having to constantly wipe your brush, for example, it will make you more creative. It'll make your paintings and your approaches that much richer. And let me explain to you how this process has affected my process. So everybody has different things that they like to start to do better. Some people are really good at middles. Some people are really good at beginnings, and other people are good at endings like that. Like there's a certain space of any kind of project. Like some people like have a time span that they like to do things. Like I love 12-week projects. I'm not a 2-year project girl, but my husband makes films, and like he'll have an idea, write a script, and then it can be 4 years later that they come out. I mean, it's just so we all have our thermometer, dial, whatever, of the things that make us tick as creative people. So one of the ways to enhance your creative output and activity and find your voice is, like you were saying, is by producing more, right? And because oil dries slow, you can paint in layers. See, I'll start 3 to 4 canvases at once. And when I have a show that I'm doing, like I will start 3 to 4 paintings every Monday, but I only start paintings at the end of the day because I'm not warmed up enough yet. So at any given moment, there's like 4 or 5 paintings going on in my studio, and they're facing the wall. And they're facing the wall because I don't want to dwell, and I don't want to see them while they're drawing, while that layer is drawing. I want that first look experience. So you know how you referenced a movie, I'll reference a movie. Did you see The Jerk?
Yeah.
So there was a scene in The Jerk where Mary Lou Henner says she's the fabulous friend of Sarah Jessica Parker. Or no, she's the fabulous friend of somebody. I got the movie wrong maybe. But anyway, and she says, whenever I go out, I look in the mirror really fast, and whatever stands out, I take it off. Like you want that first look experience, like, oh, this necklace is too loud, I'm taking it off, And so in order to have that first look experience, you need to have them facing against the wall. So when I go into the studio in the day, I only do middles and ends. And so I turn a painting around and I instantly see what either needs to be adjusted or moved or whatever, what my next move is. And it kind of warms me up into my rhythm, and it's not until later in the day that I begin paintings, because I begin them on tone canvases that I want to really be fresh. So you should be not attempting to make a painting in a single day. You should do them in layers, and it should be at least 3 layers so that you can take advantage of putting layers of color on the bottom that will then stimulate the colors on top. So you never make a sunset. I went to the Getty Museum yesterday, and there was a Poussin exhibition, which was, it was insane. It was just insane. The skies are insane. But like in some of the skies, like you're never going to paint, if let's say you have a sky and it's yellows to violets to kind of greenish to blue, and it's always going darker as you get to the horizon, for example. You're not going to just paint those colors on white. You needed to have a color underneath it. You need to have an insane cadmium yellow at the horizon line with, you need to be shocking. And then you let that dry completely. And even if it's 2 days later, and then you put the color that you want over it, and those colors underneath will make the colors above it sparkle in a way that you're not going to get by just doing alla prima with turpentine. So if you take the risk, and it's not even a risk because it's much riskier to paint with toxic chemicals and whatnot. If you're willing to give it a try, and you're willing to expand the timeline that it takes for you to create a painting, and be willing to say, I'm going to do this layer next week, I'm going to start multiple paintings, you will find yourself to be a better painter, a better artist, and you will get to that speed, that kind of light speed that you want to get, that frictionlessness where you get to paint what you see in your mind's eye faster. Like that experience we're all gunning for, you will get to it faster by reducing solvents. So it affects you. So and it makes you more creative.
And smarter if the solvents are not killing your brain cells.
Right. Exactly.
So first of all, thank you so much for your time today and being so giving of all of this incredible information. And I'll be putting this up where people can see it, but this book is a must-have. Please wrap us up with your best career advice. We didn't even get a chance to talk about your amazing career, but you've exhibited all over. So some career advice for fine artists who'd like to find galleries and like to get out there and be seen.
It's so simple. You must build a body of work. Stop going to that class or whatever where you're just doing studies over and over again. Even if you're in the phase, because we're all in the phase of learning, you should come up with a subject, even if it's, cloudscapes at 4 p.m. at this lake, if you want to do 20 of those, when I first started painting, I knew it's like somebody handed me a piano and said, express yourself. Like you need to figure out how to play it. It's not, painting is a craft ultimately. So I set out an assignment to paint 100 nudes. And I was just in the wilderness of my mind and trying to understand this material. But when I was approached to have an exhibition and I was having people over and look at all these nudes, I picked the top 14 or whatever to exhibit. So I made way more than I needed. But then when you look at the history books, you think, God, these people, they're so amazing. It just comes out of them. You don't know about Francis Bacon slashing hundreds of his canvases before he died so that they'd never be seen. Like you only see the best. You don't see all the times that they sucked. Especially the further back we look in history, we just see their best work. So it's so intimidating. And I call it the Mount Rushmore effect. Like you sort of think, God, everybody, look at they're an artist. They're like on Mount Rushmore or whatever. No, they were just slogging through just like you, So make a body of work. And when you do that, I highly recommend hiring an art writer or somebody really smart, but that can write about art to make an essay about it, where you give them talk to them, obviously, so they're going to know what you're thinking and what was behind it beyond just what the painting is, and make a catalog of that body of work. And I was arts editor of the Huffington Post. I founded it. I founded the art section of the Huffington Post. And you could so tell the professionals. And when you walk into a gallery, I would say 50 to 90% of the time, I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. Yeah, I could do better than this. Like, I'm like, whatever. Okay, whatever. But being a dealer, being a gallerist, it's a business. And yes, there are some businesses that have, and many of them have alternate sources of income, but they're making an investment in you as an artist. And they have their wall space is precious, and they're paying rent, and they're paying publicity people, and they want to promote you and make you legit. And you need to give them the ammo to show that you are legit and that you take yourself seriously and you're not just talented, because talent is just one part of the equation. You need to show that you're a pro and that you take yourself seriously, and other people have looked at your work and have other ideas about it. So that's my big, I think that's really important. I teach a masterclass called Build a Body of Work. And I open it up once a year, and artists apply from all over the world. And it's like we meet on Zoom 3 times a month. And I give them all the tools to begin that process, from finding your North Star to, the whole thing. So at the end of 6 months. But anyway, you can find my workshops at workshops.kimberlybrooks.com, or just go to kimberlybrooks.com on my website. But that's the critical advice I would give. And if you want to see, I made a very short video of me kind of talking about this, and I think the masterclass, it's kimberlybrooks.com/masterclass. But I only open it once a year.